Well, now for our next presentation, we will turn the microphone over to the Poet Laureate of St. Bernard Parish. Bill Hyland is, of course, parish historian. He is the president of the St. Bernard Parish Historical Society, and he is one of the leading voices in understanding the cultural milieu of this particular piece of real estate from about the time period of the War of 1812. And he is going to talk to us today about what St. Bernard was like at the time of the Battle of New Orleans. Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Hyland.
Well, you know, I'll have you know, and I was speaking to Marty before the presentation, and I'll have you know that I've been called many things by many people, recently and in the past, but this is the first time I've been called Poet Laureate. So I certainly am flattered. And to rather expand on a couple of things that I heard in Mr. Midkiff's wonderful presentation, you know, when Jackson came to Louisiana and to New Orleans through the Lake Pontchartrain and Bayou St. John, he did that in 1814, and he also did that the next time that he came in the 1820s. And there's a wonderful story about that, which was written by Bernard de Marigny. And I'm so happy he took the time to write this. And he had particularly, Marigny, grown weary of the mayor at the time, Joseph Raffignac. So in any event, Jackson came in the 1820s, and he came through the bayou, and he landed near the Canyon House, which was sometimes called the Spanish House. And it's today at the corner of Grand Route St. John and the bayou. Or maybe a little bit beyond that, because that whole area was the portage. But in any event, there was a driving rain with thunder and lightning, and everyone standing there was drenched, overcoats dripping in water, hats blown in the bayou, everything askew. And of course, Jackson stepped off the barge, and there was the mayor, and he said, "Monsieur le Général, let me assure you that the sun has never shone more brightly now than when you are among us." So you see, politicians never change. So it's great to be here today, and again, I will speak to you from something of a disadvantage because I really need to have images, and by God, if it's the last thing I do, I'm going next year to have images to go along with some of these presentations that I do. So let's talk about St. Bernard Parish in 1815, and let's look at the origin of St. Bernard Parish. The area below New Orleans, and when we speak of New Orleans in its colonial context, we're speaking of the French Quarter. The area below New Orleans from what would become the Faubourg Marigny at the time of the battle, down all the way to English Turn, was, until the Spanish period, under the jurisdiction of New Orleans directly. And then when the Spaniards settled Canary Islanders in Louisiana in an effort to halt the British colonial encroachment, which the Spaniards perceived would happen or might happen in the 18th century, they settled Canary Islanders along waterways that led to the Mississippi River. One of those waterways was Bayou Terre-aux-Bœufs in St. Bernard Parish. So the actual original Población de San Bernardo, or St. Bernard settlement, was established behind the plantation that would become Poydras Plantation later in the 19th century. So it began at the rear boundary of that plantation, which was at Poydras today, 1.5 miles to 2 miles off the Mississippi River, more like 1.5 miles. So that was the uppermost boundary of St. Bernard Parish. And then, of course, after we became American, Governor Claiborne, in his zeal, tried to make us become instantly American, and he thought that common law procedure should be the way to go. And there are many today who still feel that way, and not without just cause. But in any event, and at that time, instead of the 19 administrative districts which the Spaniards had, he erected a system of counties. So from 1805 until 1807, St. Bernard, Plaquemine, and what would become Jefferson Parish were all the county of Orleans. And then in 1807, there was legislation introduced before the territorial legislature of Louisiana. And the result of that legislation was that the old Spanish districts were recreated, this time as civil parishes. And they were called parishes because when we had been French and also when we had been Spanish, each of these districts had a Roman Catholic church parish, or paroisse, or parroquia. So even if it were the Puesto de San Bernardo or the Puesto de San Juan Bautista, St. John the Baptist, using those two examples, people commonly who lived in those districts or posts called them parishes because of the church parish. So that, I believe, is the origin of the parish system here in Louisiana. And so when we were resurrected as a separate civil entity, a separate civil jurisdiction in 1807, the parish of St. Bernard was described as the settlements of Bayou Terre-Haute. So this meant then that the original 1807 parish of St. Bernard included the settlements along Bayou Terre-Haute. So essentially, the Spanish settlement of St. Bernard. And then, of course, in 1809, the boundary was adjusted again by the territorial legislature. And then in 1811, the territorial legislature brought the western or uppermost limit of St. Bernard Parish to include Poydras Plantation. So that's when St. Bernard Parish reached the Mississippi River in 1811. It was not until 1817 that the parish boundary was moved from Poydras Plantation north and westward to the Canal des Pêcheurs, or the Fisherman's Canal. And that canal is today roughly around Aycock Street in Arabic. So when the Battle of New Orleans was fought in 1815, it was indeed fought in the parish of Orleans. And that's why it's the Battle of New Orleans. But in any event, so let's go back now to the 1811, 1815 Población de San Bernardo, or St. Bernard Parish. The Isleños were settled there in 1779. They were given land grants, and these land grants followed what people have come to style, historians have come to style, the long lot system, all fronting Bayou Terre-Haute. The land grants ranged in size from half an arpent, which is roughly equivalent to an acre. It's an archaic unit of French measure, by a depth of 40 arpents, so 1.5 miles, more or less. And the people who came here from the Canary Islands were farmers. They were recruited to come here by the Spanish government to serve in the Louisiana Regiment, and then because they were farmers, they also, by the time that they successfully established themselves, began feeding the city of New Orleans. The first houses which appear to have been built for the Canary Island people had earthen floors, and they were what was called poteaux en terre, posts in earth. And there's some descriptions in inventories of some of the Isleños who had some wealth, had some money, And so we know from two inventories what these houses were like. They were 2 rooms, and they were walled with stakes, and they were roofed with cypress stakes. So you could see that they were very primitive, with a porch, or what we used to call a gallery in front and a gallery in back. And then later, Francois Deléré, acting under contract to the Spanish government with a slave team from Senegal, built many or most of the houses that the Spanish government had promised to the colonists when they came here. They promised to give them not only land grants, which they did, but they also gave them housing, and then they also gave them livestock, a small stipend, and all of it they needed to establish themselves here. And of course, they came to a virgin territory. There was nothing but forest there. They had to clear the forest, and it was quite an effort for them. But by the 1780s, the early 1780s, they were beginning to prosper as farmers. And Pierre Clément de Lossac wrote that the Isleños were feeding the city of New Orleans with vegetables and most of the poultry sold in the city, so that you could see that they were very industrious people. The houses that Deléré built were also 2 rooms. The rooms measured in total 12 by 26. They were mud and moss, or bousillage, between posts. And remarkably, having worked with Gene Cizik and the people at Tulane University, it seems that we were able to save what might be the last of those houses and bring one to our Isleño Museum complex many years ago, and we've been able to restore it. But moving ahead now, so the Isleños were very, very successful as farmers. They had first served from 1792 in a regiment called the Volunteers of the Mississippi. And that regiment included membership of people living in the Côte d'Ambert, which was the colonial name of Plaquemine Parish, and of course St. Bernard, and some of the lower coast of Orleans Parish, and what would later become St. Bernard. Pierre de Marigny was the first captain of that group, and then later he was succeeded by his cousin, Pierre Denis de la Ronde. When we became American, the Volunteers of the Mississippi were reorganized or reconstituted as the 3rd Regiment of Louisiana Militia. And Pierre Denis de la Ronde was appointed commandant of that, or colonel and commandant of that militia unit. Denis de la Ronde had been in St. Bernard working with the Canary Islanders from their arrival in Louisiana, and he actually helped to settle them in St. Bernard. He was very fluent in Spanish. He fought in the Galvez expedition against the British in the American Revolution. And he had an excellent working relationship with the Spanish people. And as a matter of fact, I think it was in the Louisiana Gazette, he published a statement stating that the Canary Islanders had fought very valiantly in the December 23rd night skirmish, and that, of course, many of them had been taken prisoner. And when we examine the militia roster from the National Archives, we see that their payments in the militia stopped December 23rd. They received nothing after December 23rd. So that shows that the majority of them were taken prisoner. Looking also at St. Bernard, let's now look at the old Poydras plantation. That was a working indigo plantation which had been converted to sugar, and it was one of the largest and most beautiful plantations in the colonial era near New Orleans. It had a principal house, it had dovecotes, it had 3 barns, it had extensive stables, it had livestock. It was a very, very important place. And of course, General Wilkinson had actually been stationed there about 1809 or 10, and many of his troops had succumbed to yellow fever there. And then now let's begin to look at the remainder of what we know today as modern St. Bernard, which was not St. Bernard in 1815. There was a series of plantations along the river which were some of the most important in Louisiana. The precedent of very important and wealthy people living below New Orleans had been set when we were French, because remember, you either would come up the river directly or you would come in. Ultimately, the favorite route became, particularly during flood times, coming through the lake route, which would have been the Rigolets into Lake Pontchartrain and then into Bayou St. John, and then following the old Indian paths, which became the road to Bayou St. John, the road to Bayou Gentilly, and then, of course, Bayou Road itself, which still exists in New Orleans. It's very interesting, you know, that street technically is older than the city of New Orleans because it was used by the Native Americans. But in any event, the plantations below New Orleans was some of the most extensive. Louis Loyer had a plantation in St. Bernard, as well as Magloire Guichard, who was Speaker of the House of Representatives. His plantation was at what we call today Violet. And then as we move up the river, as early as the 1720s, Jacques Chapron had a very extensive plantation. And there was a wonderful piece brought out by the Historic New Orleans Collection a few years ago, a memoir by Marc-Antoine Caillot. And he talks about stopping in that plantation and how relieved he was to be able to get out of the pirogue that he was in because he was being devoured by mosquitoes. And how even at that early date, the plantation was just very comfortable, and he hoped that he would find New Orleans more comfortable, or at least as comfortable, because you can imagine coming to this place, it was really very, very primitive then. And then, of course, as we come upriver, we had the plantation of Charles Jumonville de Villiers at the time of the battle. And that plantation was actually the official hospital of the British. And we can trace that plantation's history back again to the 1720s. It was owned in its first incarnation by a French colonist whose name was Bertrand Jaffre. And Mr. Jaffre had the nickname, or he was called La Liberté, liberty. Now, Monsieur Liberté later on had a land grant in St. Tammany Parish in the vicinity of what we call Slidell today, along the banks of a bayou, which we call today Bayou Liberty for him. But in any event, Bertrand Jaffre in the 1720s and 30s had a very successful indigo plantation there. He also made tar, he also made pitch there, which was used in the city of New Orleans. Later, well, no, actually it was during that period, the ancestor of the Olivier de Vezin family, François Olivier de Vezin, was for a time the chief engineer in Louisiana, and he made a wonderful plan of that plantation. It's in the New Orleans Notarial Archives, and you can see the principal house, the outbuildings, the slave quarters, so that you can see in this 1730-something, 40-something, I can't remember, I'm sorry, plan, you can see just how extensive it was. And of course, throughout the 18th century and into the early 19th century, that plantation retained its desirability. And then, of course, as we come upriver, the next plantation was the plantation of Jacques-Philippe Villeray. And Jacques-Philippe Villeray was born in New Orleans. His father had died at the hands of the Spaniards when they came to establish their regime here. And he became the first native Louisianian to serve as governor. of the state of Louisiana. And not only that, he also served in the first state constitutional convention of 1812 and was a great statesman here. So in any event, his plantation also was very elaborate, and there are many interesting plans and images of the house, plans of the plantation from the 18th century forward that document just how important it was. And of course, in the 18th century, earlier in the 18th century, it had been an indigo plantation. By the time that Villeroy acquired the plantation, it had become a sugar plantation. Moving upriver from the Villeroy plantation next was the plantation of Pierre Lacoste. And today that's the site, among other things, of Chalmette High School. As a matter of fact, the high school itself is built atop the site of the house. And in any event, that plantation also is just fascinating. It had belonged to the Ursuline nuns. And they used the plantation to generate revenue for the convent. There was active lumbering that went on there. They also had vegetable crops, which they grew there, which we understand were used to help feed the people living in the convent and the boarders and the people being educated there. So, and then of course, Pierre Lacoste was a very enigmatic man. He had a very mysterious past. He was involved in a murder during the Spanish period, but somehow the Cabildo brushed it away, and he was very prominent. He commanded some of the free people of color in the Battle of New Orleans and was very much respected by them. Coming up river from Lacoste was the plantation of Pierre Denis de la Ronde. And this house was the most spectacular house below New Orleans in 1815, and probably one of the finest houses in territorial southern Louisiana. It was 2 stories. It was surrounded by galleries on both floors. It had a hipped roof. Beautiful hand-painted blocked wallpaper was in the house, and specimens of it still exist in Tulane Special Collections. That property also has a title that can be traced to the 1720s. One of the more interesting owners of that tract before Denis de la Ronde was Jean Balthazar de Pomfret, the Chevalier de Mazon. Mazant Street, M-A-Z-A-N-T Street in New Orleans is named for him. He was a very, very wealthy planter. He cultivated indigo there. He had one of the largest private libraries in colonial Louisiana in the principal house on the property that would become de la Ronde. He also, with his partner, Louis Barret, who was Etienne Barret's father, succeeded in 1764 in partially granulating sugar. He granulated the sugar, but wouldn't you know, it turned to syrup by the time it got to France. And then, of course, he made the great mistake of becoming involved with Lafrenière and the people who wanted to retain control of Louisiana and chose not to work with the Spaniards. So after Spain established her domain here firmly, his property was confiscated and he was sent to El Morro in La Habana, which still exists. It was a horrible prison then, and there are still people who know it as a prison, I regret to say, but in Cuba. And then, of course, after that, the Spanish government auctioned the property. And, of course, you know, a great Spanish military officer purchased that property. His name was Bartolomé McNamara. He was one of the Irish who had fled Great Britain or Ireland and had settled in Spain in the 18th century. And that's a whole other story. Then as we go upriver from there, the next plantation was that of Antoine Bienvenu. Now his father had come from Kaskaskia, north of here, near the confluence of the Mississippi River and the Belle Riviere, which we call today the Ohio River. And in 1749, he purchased a plantation in Arabic. But anyway, Antoine Bienvenu, the son, was very much the bon vivant, but he also ran a rather strict shop with his slaves, and he also had a very large home, and it was very comfortable. It was plundered by the British, and some of the British officers actually recorded the wonderful Madeira and port that they enjoyed there in the house that he left behind. As we come upriver from Bienvenu, by the way, that Bienvenu tract, again, is traceable to the 1720s. For many years, it belonged to François Régieux. He had been the Attorney General of Louisiana, or the Procureur Général, when we were French. And he had come here from the northern part of what is today Italy, and he was the great-grandfather of General Beauregard. Anyway, coming up, the next plantation was Chalmette. And, of course, Chalmette was Denis Laurent's half-brother, a very interesting person, but regretfully a person who's been forgotten in large measure. We know Chalmette, but we don't know who Chalmette was. Chalmette was born in New Orleans in 1755. He was an officer in the Spanish militia. He fought in the Galvez expedition. He was commandant of the Arkansas post. His poor wife, Victoire Vorgine, couldn't take seeing her sons running barefooted and her daughters running barefooted in Arkansas. So they decided that they would come to the comparative civilization of New Orleans. And they did that in 1794. He ultimately became an indigo and sugar planter, and he purchased along the Mississippi River several tracts of land, which by 1815 had become the Chalmette Plantation. His house had to be destroyed by Jackson. He lost everything, and in February of 1815, he died. He was very much a broken man. His estate was valued at $80,000. The inventory still exists, and his succession record still exists. But his losses were much greater than that. So in any event, moving upriver from there was the plantation of Edmond McCarty. Now here's another Frenchman, McCarty, who actually was McCarthy McTeague, and they had fled Ireland, and instead of going to Spain, they went to Brittany in France. And then from there, part of the family came here. Edmond McCarty had married a daughter of Jean-Noël Détrehan, which we mispronounce today as Destrehan, and he had built a beautiful house which became General Jackson's battlefield headquarters during the Battle of New Orleans. It stood until 1907, and also in between the McCarty property and the Chalmette property line was the Rodriguez plantation, which belonged to Juan Rodriguez. He was not a Canary Islander. He was from the mainland of Spain. He was an attorney, very prominent person, and he had inhabited the house as a summer home. And it was also used by General Jackson as a temporary headquarters. And then finally above that was the plantation of Antoine Bienvenu, the father. And he had purchased that plantation from Governor Vaudreuil, who left Louisiana and was the governor who surrendered New France to the British at the end of the 7 Years' War. But in any event, he had there an indigo plantation. It stretched from Mealy Avenue all the way to the downriver property line of American Sugar Refinery. And it was one of the largest and most important sugar plantations in what would become St. Bernard. So I guess now I've completely confused all of you. I hope that I've been able to be somewhat coherent, and I hope I've given you an image of the complexity of St. Bernard. You know, we had Canary Islanders living on Bayou Terrebonne in what was then the only real St. Bernard parish in 1815. There was a large community, particularly along Bayou Terrebonne, not a large community, but a sizable community of free people of color who lived there as well. We had a daughter of Pierre-Philippe de Marigny, a natural daughter, whose name was Eulalie Monteville. We had another person, Pierre Thomas, or Pierre Thomas, that's a familiar name to everyone. And Pierre had fought in the Galvez expedition, and he was given a land grant that became Shell Beach and later the Proctor Plantation. Then we moved to the Mississippi River. And along that river, you had some of the most important plantations in Louisiana, sugar plantations, at the time of the Battle of New Orleans. So I hope I haven't gone on too long, you know. And now, if you have any questions, I'll do my feeble best to answer them. Paris Road, the Chemin de Paris, was opened by Daniel Warburg in the 1830s. And he had purchased the Denis de la Ronde plantation from the succession. Pierre Denis de la Ronde was the only one of the planters, of the major planters, who completely recovered from the Battle of New Orleans. All the other planters, within 10 years, lost their plantations or sold their plantations. He kept his until 1824. Then finally, when his wife, Denis de la Ronde's wife, died, Eulalie Gerbois, the plantation was subdivided and the Chemin de Paris, or Parish Road, was opened. And it was originally conceived as an area in which to build very comfortable weekend or summer houses. And it was used that way. Later in the 1830s, the original plan was just long lots facing Parish Road. That was not very popular, so then Warburg re-subdivided the De La Ronde plantation. I know Judy Hoffmeister's in the audience. She knows all about re-subdivisions from her time on the council. In the 1830s, he re-subdivided the plantation, and then that's when you got the present street grid today with Genius Street and Montesquieu and Fenelon and all those names. And before I stop, I would be very remiss. I'm so delighted that my cousin Roger Villeray is in the audience today, Villeray and his two brothers. It's an honor to have you here and to have you back in your ancestral home of St. Bernard. And then my Denis de la Ronde cousin, who is always here, Jean Williams, is here too. So I hope that I've done well by the family, and I hope that I haven't disturbed you all too much. Do you have any other questions?
Yes, sir. You said Canary Islanders. Do you know which islands they mostly came from?
I certainly do. It's interesting that you bring that question up. I remember many years ago, Frank Fernandez looked at me and he said, "William, I know you can read that old Spanish." He says, I don't know where to go. And I said, "Well, you know, Uncle Frank, we need to go to Our Lady of Lourdes Church in Violet because the records are there, the sacramental records, and the demographic information will be contained therein. And in those sacramental records with the demographic information, which are now in the archives of the New Orleans Archdiocese, in the baptisms, following even the tradition that is presently pursued in Spain, there was the name of the baptized child, parents, paternal and maternal grandparents, and where they were born. So, to answer your question, they came primarily from Tenerife, Gran Canaria, La Gomera. We had some from Lanzarote. We have my cousin Corbe Acosta in the audience. Our ancestor, Roque Acosta, came from Fuerteventura. And then we had some from La Palma. And actually, there were colonists recruited in all the islands, but those are the ones who made it to St. Bernard. Yes. Any other questions? Okay, well, I can hear him. I know Skip's voice well. the question is, or was, what is the origin of the name Wyclosky? And that's a very interesting question. I'm so happy you bring it up. When we read through the title of the Proctor Plantation, we see that it was owned originally by Pierre Thomas, who was a free man of color. Then it changed hands. It belonged to Louis Regio, Pierre Denis Laron, Bernard de Marigny, and then it was bought by the Richardson and Proctor family. And it says in the title that the Bayou Yscloxy, Y-S-C-L-O-C-S-Y, Yscloxy, vulgairement appelé Biloxi, so commonly called Biloxi, ran through roughly the center of this 1,000-arpent tract. So this is in 1824. So it's rather obvious that Yscloxy is an Indian name, a Native American name. And it wasn't spelled Wyclosky. It's Y-S-C-L-O-C-S-Y. And by the way, Skip, I know you're good as a title abstractor. You can find that in the Acts of Hugues de la Verne in 1824. And that's long before the Eastern Europeans came here. So it would be nice to say that we had a bayou and a town named for a Pole, as many people think, because it would contribute to our diversity. But we just weren't quite that diverse in 1824. Yes.
So many of the plantations above the city, along the river, above the city, have lasted. But nothing down here lasted. Why not?
Well, a variety of reasons. One, we were, particularly in St. Bernard and Plaquemine, we've been victim of natural disasters, many more even than upriver. That's number one. Number two, particularly in the parish of St. Bernard, we had pressure to industrialize at the very beginning of the 20th century. This is one of the areas, and it will be something for a 20th century historian to look at, one of the areas that was first industrialized in the heavy industry sense of the 20th century. That contributed to the destruction of much of what we had. Much of it was destroyed as a result of demolition by neglect. For instance, the Parish plantation burned in 1939. No one was living in it. The Villeray house was destroyed when an oil refinery went there, and then there was very little of it left before the oil refinery established itself there. Demolition by neglect has also been a very important factor in the destruction of things. And then also remember that many of these plantations were subdivided by the planters from the late 19th century forward, with the repeal of protective tariffs, which protected our sugar industry. It really became not profitable for many of the planters living in St. Bernard to grow sugarcane. So they subdivided their plantations and they sold them to the Sicilians. That's why in Chalmette we have Gallo Drive, Palmisano Drive. These are the names of some of the Sicilians who came and who helped to create modern Chalmette and modern St. Bernard Parish. The Lacoste House stood at the Chalmette High School site until the early 1960s. And then the police jury, which was the governing authority at the time, determined that the house was a safety hazard, so they demolished it. The police jury in the 1880s also destroyed the Delarond house for the same reason. So I guess it's rather ironic that in 2016, the governing authority of St. Bernard has a parish historian, whereas in the 1880s and in the 1960s, they were destroying our history. So any other questions?
I was curious on how you the word plantation, was it, what are the requirements of a plantation back in the 1720s versus, I guess, as it went up through history, but what about the word Araby? Where does that come from?
Well, that's a subject of some debate. Let's first answer what constitutes a plantation. A plantation from the 18th century until today is a working farm. You know, it took on this great, glowing, romantic connotation in the 19th century. But a plantation was a working farm generating crops for profit. And, you know, for instance, I can remember my cousin, John Fournette, who was Chief Justice of the Louisiana Supreme Court and had been Lieutenant Governor. He was from St. Martinville, and he grew up on a sugar plantation there. And I remember him telling me that after his father had gotten so very ill, at the age of 12, he became the man of the plantation, and he would ride through the fields at the age of 12, running the crews of workmen. And of course, if you'd known Uncle John, who was taller than I am, you could well see him at the age of 12 doing that and more. But it was very hard work being, you know, having a plantation. But that's what a plantation is, a farm that produces a crop for profit. And then in terms of Araby, the origin of the name Araby, we believe, derives from Araby Pasha, who was a revolutionary in the Nile Valley. There was a contest to select a name for the post office at Stock Landing, Louisiana, near the old slaughterhouse. It was then called Stock Landing, not Araby. And so the post office won the name Araby. So until the 19-teens, it was Stock Landing, Louisiana, Araby Post Office. So I hope that answers your question.